You're watching Capital City Sunday.
The latest Marquette Law School survey of Wisconsin came out this week, and it shows the presidential race is still very close. Among likely voters, former President Donald Trump holds 51%. President Joe Biden holds 49% of the vote. That percentage is the same for registered voters, too. Now, one of the major issues affecting President Biden in the polls is the war in Gaza and how his administration is handling the conflict. Now we know the stakes are even higher. Late last week, Israel launched missiles in a reported retaliatory strike against Iran. This in response to Iran's direct attack on Israel just over a week ago. Now, I sat down with a UW-Madison international relations expert before we learned of Israel's attack. We talked through what this could mean for a wider regional conflict and future U.S. involvement. Here with me now is John Pevehouse, a UW-Madison International Relations professor. John, thanks so much for taking some time to be here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So let's start with this. Iran and Israel have had a tense relationship for decades, but the countries haven't resorted to direct attacks of this nature. What's changed?
So what changed was essentially Iran deciding that the last set of indirect attacks, which you referred to, which was an Israeli attack on a consulate in Syria, an Iranian consulate in Syria on April 1st, was sort of had crossed some line. So Iran decided that to show strength and to try to deter Israel from doing this further, they would attack Israel proper with drones, ballistic missiles. And so that really kind of escalated this conflict in the region.
Now, this is unprecedented. So how Israel respond is going to be crucial. So how will that response to the attack impact the course of the current conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas?
Great. So Israel has several options on the table. I mean, one, they could ignore. That's not going to happen. Another option that Israel has would be to sort of strike again in a place like Syria or in Yemen, a place where Iranian proxies are, whether Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? They have numerous options here. And so that would be kind of an indirect, like we're going to tit for tat back at you. The real tension right now in Israel is whether they should respond in Iran proper. Should Israel attack Iran's homeland and take it kind of that war back to them? That's the big debate going on. I think that risks a significant escalation, and that is the debate going on between not only within Israel, but between Israel and the United States and Israel and other like European allies as to how much of a leash do they have to essentially go out after Iran and their mainland.
And John, if we see an escalation in this conflict, what does that mean for Western allies?
Well, it means the deeper involvement. The United States has been very clear, as have France and the UK, that they will not help Israel attack Iran. They'll continue to help defend Israel from Iran, but they will not help them take the war to Iran. So Israel is on their own in that regard. So there won't be direct, deeper involvement in that. That said, if it escalates, if Iran attacks Israel again, just like the U.S., France, and the UK were involved in the defense of Iran this time, Israel this time, we would certainly be involved there. And any wider conflict this might spur between Lebanon and Israel, or more attacks from Syria, the U.S. will likely, again, as Biden has said, an ironclad security guarantee for Israel. And the U.S. would, I think, definitely increase our presence and continue to actively support Israel in that escalated conflict.
Across the country and here in Wisconsin, anti-war protesters are making strong statements. In Wisconsin's spring election, thousands of people voted uninstructed in the Democratic presidential primary as a protest over the Biden administration's handling of the war in Gaza. That was a nationwide effort. We have seen actual protests across the country, blocking traffic, blocking bridges, things like that. So that is a strong sentiment here. And how does that play into the administration's handling of the conflict?
Sure. Let me say two things about that. Number one, it definitely constrains them. And so, for example, odds are the Biden administration would not have pushed Israel to respond directly into Iran. But for sure, with this public opinion trends the way that you outline, there's no way that Biden will support Israel in doing that. The other thing I will say, and that said, I do think the Biden administration will continue to support Israel on the Iran side. But that's the second point. In a way, this was a huge blunder by Iran, right? As you say, public opinion had been turning. There's more and more criticism of Israel and the war in Gaza. And this kind of makes it about not that anymore. Now, again, Gaza will continue to get the attention it needs and deserves in the press and in the public opinion. But now there's a whole nother added aspect. And that kind of plays into Israel's take on this whole crisis, which is that this is an Iranian-Israel proxy conflict, even in Gaza. And so in that sense, I think this was kind of a strategic mistake on Iran's part to really try to widen this war at this time. Because, as you say, Israel was getting a lot of criticism. And now, yes, they're still being criticized, but that's starting to be muted now that there's this other aspect of the war.
And we've touched on this militarily, but as far as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, what is and what can the United States be doing right now? Because that is a huge, almost overwhelming part of these protests, is people in Gaza are suffering.
Absolutely. So there's many possibilities. At a basic level, the United States could do more to provide aid to the people who are suffering in Gaza. The United States has agreed to build essentially a new pier in Gaza to allow the increased delivery of supplies. They could put pressure on Israel to end the war politically. That was where the Biden administration was heavily going until these attacks. And again, I think behind the scenes they certainly still are. But this, again, just brings another dimension in where, Biden went from almost every time you heard him talk for the last 2 weeks, it was quite critical of Israel. Now he's back to somewhat critical, but also supportive, right? And so the U.S. is trying to walk this line between saying we don't like what's going on in Gaza. Many in the administration, most in the administration, think Israel has gone too far, should scale back. But at the same time, supporting Israel's self-defense, trying to get the hostages returned out of Gaza. And so it's kind of the Biden administration is caught between these multiple competing goals in the conflict.
For the everyday consumer, the impacts of war often trickle down to us. So how are we seeing right now the conflict in the Middle East affecting us, but also should the conflict widen? What does that mean for us here at home?
Great. I would say in the near term, like right now, it's been okay. In the response to the Iranian attack on Israel, oil prices did not increase, for example. They stayed fairly flat. In response to some Iranian forces capturing a freighter going into the Persian Gulf last week, markets stayed pretty calm. If calm continues, if it's a limited Israeli response, the markets, I think, will hold. If this escalates, especially if there starts to be a shipping conflict, as we saw in the 80s in the Persian Gulf, you will see the price of oil go up. And that will drive then the price of everything else up. And already dealing with inflationary pressures, that could be bad news for consumers, could be bad news for global financial markets as well.
John Pevehouse, thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Former Wisconsin Congressman Peter Barca announced a run for the 1st Congressional District this past week. That covers much of southeastern Wisconsin, as well as about half of Rock County, including Janesville. Barca, a Democrat, represented the 1st Congressional District from 1993 to 1995. Then he joined the State Assembly and most recently served as Secretary for the State Department of Revenue. Barca is the first well-known Democrat to get into the race against incumbent Republican Brian Stile. Stile has represented the district since 2019. Before that, it was Paul Ryan's congressional seat. Vice President Kamala Harris is set to visit La Crosse tomorrow. That's according to her office, which says that on the trip, she plans to, quote, continue fighting for workers, supporting families, and improving health care for people across America. This is the vice president's 3rd visit to Wisconsin this year. Well, that is it for this edition of Capital City Sunday. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have any questions or interview suggestions for the show, you can always send me an email. But for now, we'll see you back here next week. Same time, same place.